So thank you all for coming tonight. I wonder if we could start. I know David introduced you each, but I wonder if you could say a bit more about the kind of work that you do, if you have a particular beat that you focus on, or something that you've been reporting on recently, just to share a bit more about the work you do.
Sure. So I am on the state team with Grace and our colleague Janelle O'Day, who covers Southern Illinois. And our team is focused on bolstering local investigations and local journalism outside of Cook County. And so my region of interest is Central Illinois. So I'm not targeted to a specific beat per se, but I definitely have an interest in healthcare related stories, social services, but really anything under the sun. So.
I cover primarily anything related to public finance and spending and budgets in specifically the city of Chicago and Cook County. Love covering Cook County taxation and assessments because I'm a weirdo like that. And in addition to budgets and finance and spending, just sort of like nuts and bolts of how government works on a day-to-day basis, things like building inspections and street pavings and tree trimmings and sort of digging into how things work and sometimes don't.
Yeah, and I think my beat is pretty broad, equity and economic opportunity, but I think oh, no, the mic is not working? Did you turn it on? I don't have the same button that you do. Alrighty, is this better? Yes. But I think there's a lot of stories about how it's not working.
It was on.
Sorry. All right, we're just going to pass this one between the three of us here. No, I was just saying that, I think I can project if this one goes out. Yeah, I think a lot about what the resources that are in some places and not others that's a part of everyday's life, And, I spent a lot of my life going to meetings, school board meetings, board of trustees meetings. But actually, recently I had coffee with Jim, who's in the audience, and I was thinking about who are the people, what are the meetings I'm going to now, right? Now that I covered this topic, and who are the people I'm following? And it's sort of a lot of these community meetings that happen in your neighborhood. And that's what sort of I did when I first started coming here to get to know different communities. So, and I think one topic of interest, since we're talking about that, I'm very interested in how we work, like labor, the jobs, especially as technology evolves and as we move farther and farther from the time where having a full-time job means you have an apartment and healthcare and you can raise a family. So, that's a topic I think that's just rich with stories as well. Do you need this?
I don't. Yes, I do. I cover public safety. I've been covering public safety in the city for almost, 14 years now. And most of my work it starts with an act of violence in some way, and then just kind of radiates out from there. And so that could be feature work. Since being at Illinois Answers, it's been trying to run incidents to ground, getting a hint of something wrong, and then trying to figure it out, and just following the paper trail and using whatever human sourcing we can to try and figure something out. I have an interest in violence as children experience it, so some of the work has been with DCFS. One of the things I think we encountered early on when I first started covering public safety was how frequently kids just have to absorb what's happening in the world, and it was a formative experience for me to try and consider okay, how do we talk to kids about this? What's it doing to their development? How are parents explaining it? And so a lot of the work, just because we're in Chicago, it starts with the Chicago Police Department, but it touches different You know, it might be CPS or the mayor's office or Department of Law or some other agency, but it's almost never one single public body that has some responsibility for whatever it is we're looking at, and then, you know, try to track whatever follow-ups we can from there.
I think, Peter, what you're touching on already is accountability. And what we want to talk about tonight is connecting power, accountability, with public trust and impact. And a lot of what we do at the BGA is accountability journalism. I wonder if you could each say a bit more about how you approach that, and if an example for you comes to mind of a story where you feel like you have accomplished that and holding somebody or something accountable.
You're starting with me? Oh, I thought
Anyone can go, or
I thought I had time to think. No, I mean, my view of accountability is like there's very little we can do to affect like a one-to-one. We do this, a thing changes. I think when the media here was at its like peak in terms of jobs and reach and influence and all that, the best we could do is hope to like that somebody would change their mind based on reading something, right? A U.S. attorney or a federal agent might read something and say, oh, that looks like bribery, we should investigate it, and eventually that leads to something. Or a politician says, oh, this is not a position I can continue to hold, or I can't keep carrying this dead weight on my staff or whatever, and then they make a change, right? As an ecosystem, we don't have the same number of bodies that there used to be doing the work. My view of this is the best, like every single story I think, okay, I want to come to as complete an accounting of this as possible. So Casey and I and a partner at the Sun-Times have been writing about a gun that was stolen from a police station, from a room full of cops. And so the act of like getting that first story out was like significant for us because we were able to prove like, okay, a thing happened that nobody wanted to talk about. And then being able to follow that through all the different changes, the handling of the internal affairs case. So like being able to come to as complete and true of an accounting of something like that, to me, is the best that we can hope to accomplish. The idea that like I don't believe that we can like that we're going to shame the police department into doing the right thing or figuring out. I just don't know that they're in, like that the police department is interested in what anybody has to say about it.
You say that, but didn't they reopen the case after your story?
They reopened it just before the story ran, after we gave them questions. They did. That's true. And so I have mixed opinions about why they did that, or what. Like the whole problem with that story was they didn't seem to take it seriously in the first place. And so like yeah, that's like an incremental advancement, but it's difficult coming to it like a real deep understanding of something. And we're fortunate. We have the benefit of like time and space and the ability to be patient and to be able to dog agencies or to fight redactions or go to court for records. Not everybody has that, right? So if a few times a year we can get like a really deep understanding of something, like that to me is a significant victory.
I can pass this down too.
Okay, great. I think for me, I view accountability, of course, like finding a bad actor and showing, the wrongdoing, I guess, but I think I view it as, in the stories that I've done, like people who are going through really challenging or often the lowest moments of their life, and what social nets are supposed to help them through that. And that can manifest in different ways. One is thinking about a story that my colleague Madison Hopkins and I did, was about the childcare assistance program, which is this government subsidy that helps families who qualify afford childcare, which is vital to everyday life and function. And what we found is that, yes, the program is working for those who qualify, but in Illinois, the restrictions are far more narrow than other states, which is keeping families out, which is affecting economic mobility, which is part of the larger package that Bing was involved in. And so here was a government program that was supposed to help folks, but it was leaving so many behind. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum, writing about jail, Grace and I have written a lot about jail conditions, particularly for folks who are struggling with mental illness. And I published a story a few weeks ago about how folks who are charged with crimes, if they're found unfit for trial, which often means that they are mentally ill and they can't understand the legal system unfolding around them, they're supposed to be sent to often a state hospital to regain fitness. And because of the lack of mental health resources and the closing of state psychiatric hospitals, people who are incredibly sick are waiting in jail and often wasting away. And that's how that's making everything worse. And so I guess that's how I view it, how systems are not working for folks.
Do we switch?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I think that the way that I would synthesize what both you, Peter and Meredith said, is that it's all about helping people understand how systems are, what they're responsible for on our behalf, and how they fail us sometimes. How we should demand them that they be accountable to us. In other words, sort of helping the public understand what the ultimate responsibilities of these agencies are and who. Not just who is to blame, but what kinds of larger, more complicated processes and systems are in place to basically where to demand change. So for example, with the police department, it will not necessarily, writing about this issue will not necessarily like change something one for one within the police department, but it is helping people sort of understand where to channel their outrage and what to actually improve. Or if people are just seeing the outcome of crime or mental health issues, we can say, here is this social safety net that has degraded over the years, and here's what people can be demanding of it or how other places are doing it better. And that is really difficult work. It often involves first us trying to understand ourselves, sort of how all these different interconnected pieces work within a system of how it all comes together. I mean, for me, an example would be how tax assessments have led to property tax bills. If you live around here in Hyde Park and Woodlawn, you probably, and you own a house, you own property, you probably got a property tax bill that was a lot higher than it was last year, and maybe wondering why that is. And there is sort of an instant, we've heard from a lot of people like, oh, the mayor raised my taxes, or like trying to understand essentially who to blame for that. And so what we are doing and what, we in our partnership with the Tribune on this example tried to do is to help people understand this very complicated web of like tax assessments that when commercial property values go down, it spreads the burden onto everyone else, and sort of understanding that, how to hold leaders accountable. That it's not going to the mayor and saying, you raise my property taxes. It's going to these different taxing agencies and understanding how to appeal or what their policies are that led them to measure it in that way. So that was, it'd be kind of a long roundabout way of saying, I think it's helping people understand the system so that the people, like the public, can be better equipped to do that work of holding power to account.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of really good points have been made by the three of you. I would add just also that I think a lot of times we want like the one story to make like the one change, right? Like both as reporters and also as readers, right? You want to say like, oh, when you feel like, wow, this has got to change. But I think in reality, it usually is like an ecosystem of like reporting that builds on each other, reporters that build on each other's reporting, and sometimes it takes like a long time, for something real, like some real change to come about. So you don't get that satisfaction right away. But I think just sort of like remembering that you are part of, this ecosystem where you're being transparent, you're delivering new information, you're advancing understanding, advancing the conversation, and then eventually something will come out of it. I think so. I think that's true, and I also think like there's a lot of power in people's personal stories. Like just so, I'm new to Chicago, so I'll share a story from when I was in Indiana. there was sort of this story that people didn't really know, that some doctors had heard about a young mother who had passed away because she wasn't able to get medical care. And, we were looking at a state that had banned abortion and also had a lot of maternity wards closed for a number of reasons. Finances, also people not going to the state to practice. And, and when we found the story, it was this young woman who had just gotten married and was really excited for her child, and didn't have, and then the hospital in her community had just closed its maternity ward, like as she was. So when this complication happened during her pregnancy, she was rushed there. They couldn't care for her, and I think even though it's one person's story, I think these personal stories really wake people up a little bit. This is what's happening when maternity wards close. It's bigger than just the statistics of X amount of people can't access it, So I just wanted to say, if you've ever told us a personal story, sometimes it takes a lot, It's you're vulnerable, you're putting yourself out there, but I think, if it's what you want to do, it makes a huge difference.
And I want to come back to that idea of the narrative and the human stories at the center of everything that we do. But first, Bing, you were talking about the importance of really pounding away at a story, sticking on something, doing the next story and the next story. And Peter, I wonder if you could share a bit about that gun story that you mentioned that was stolen from a crowded room of officers. That led to another story, and really just this whole series that went in a direction that I don't think you expected at first, because you discovered something about that team of officers that was separate from the gun. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, and then maybe each of you also share a moment where you continue to follow up on something, and it was actually maybe the follow-up story, not the first story, that had a bigger impact.
Yeah, so this started out as a tip that our colleague at the Sun-Times got, was that this gun had gone missing, and they found it. The way it came to us turned out not to be true. It was they found it on a murder victim, and when they tested it, they realized it had been used in a bunch of shootings, and it was missing from a gun buyback. But what we found out was a gun was turned into St. Sabina Church at a buyback event. These are popular, hundreds of guns at a time. Usually, Sabina's been doing this since the 90s, so 30 years. Gun goes back to the office. Police officers see it in the office, and then at some point, one of the officers realized the paperwork's messed up on it. The tag for the Glock is on a different gun, and he looks and he's like, "This is not a Glock. I don't know where's the Glock," and so they start looking for it, and the gun's missing, and it's gone for a year. And then when they find it, it's being carried a year later by a 16-year-old who was pulling car doors in South Shore. So 4 or 5 miles from where it was stolen. And the day it was stolen, the police officers were looking in each other's book bags and looking through the garbage, and they found the paperwork that had been discarded from the gun. And so they find it on this kid. He gets charged with the gun. A week later, after they test it, they're like, "This has been used in a few shootings in the year that it's been missing from our custody." And so just being able to prove by serial number that the gun had been, that was the same gun that we had suspected it was based on the police reports and all the other public records, felt significant. But we were able to just keep advancing it through pulling emails from the involved people and pulling police reports and fighting redactions and asking for the same records from different agencies, and just trying to find different ways to triangulate these little single pieces of information. Again, I've never had it. I don't feel like I've ever been so fortunate in both my editor and the space that they give us to run this stuff to ground. And it really is a luxury.
Yeah, I wonder if you all have examples too.
Well, I'm going to praise Grace for a second because she did a great series, or led a great series on restraint chairs. I recommend you check it out. But I think that was a great example of just continuing to beat the drum. She led a handful of stories at this point on the use of restraint chairs that have led to reform in different counties. And check out the site. It's great. But the story that I mentioned about folks being found unfit for trial came as a follow-up because I was talking to some individuals based in Peoria County Jail who are unfit, and they just had offhanded mention that they had been waiting for months and months. And I was like, wait, what? And then I realized that this was a statewide problem that hadn't really been talked about or talked about amongst public defenders, but not really shined a light. I think something else, this made me think of it. As part of that series, we created a zine where we were able to basically compile our findings into like a mini magazine booklet type thing. And we sent it to folks who are incarcerated because that was a major segment of our audience that we wanted to reach that wouldn't have access to the internet like we all do on a day-to-day basis. And I actually got a phone call from someone who was in a prison, I think it was Dixon the other day, and he had come across, I don't even know if I told you this, he had come across the zine because someone had it, and he just wanted to talk to me at like what his experience was like there, and he understood that it might not lead to a story, but he was like, honestly, talking to you just feels really productive and like a good way to like make me feel seen. It was very touching and moving, and so I know we'll talk about impact, but I don't know, that just was something that like the power of a follow-up, even if it doesn't lead to a story per se.
I think when I think about the benefits and the power of just being relentless on a single issue, I think about building safety and how in 2018, 2019, when our colleague Madison Hopkins started writing about this, it wasn't necessarily something that was on a lot of people's radar. It's not the sexiest thing to write about, especially because it had sometimes been in the news as like Operation Crooked Code, which is like, oh, some building inspectors are getting bribes and they're passing, bad landlords inspections. But what she put together basically 2 years worth of work with the Cecilia Reyes, the Tribune, and found that the truth is, in many ways, like it's more complicated, but in many ways darker, which is that like the system is actually set up to fail. That the system does not work, that there are not enough inspectors, and that it is all done in such a outdated and reactive basis that it's just not effective. And so this giant investigation comes out to all this fanfare in 2021.
Wins a Pulitzer.
It eventually won a Pulitzer with all of these really harrowing stories of these people who died in fires that were preventable because the Department of Buildings had gotten complaints that just never were processed or led to any remediation. The city did basically nothing. Mayor Lightfoot at the time that this came out in 2021 was asked a question about it, and she said, well, that investigation was about incidents from 2015 to 2019, and so that was like, that's old news, even though nothing had changed. And so then I come on in 2022, and we write a whole other follow-up, and Gray, who's here, worked with me on this basically entire other reporting project for another 6 months of finding a whole bunch of fresh examples of all of these buildings that had complaints that had been ignored, and went into more of sort of systemic issues with why the technology is not up to snuff, and they're still using, inspectors are going in and printing out sheets of paper of complaints and chasing them all over the city, and eventually that led into a deeper policy story about why Chicago is behind all of these other cities like Denver and Minneapolis that have moved on to like more professional proactive building inspection systems. And even then, in 2022, during budget hearings, Matthew Baudet, the city buildings commissioner, at that point, at least he started getting asked questions by aldermen, hey, can we move to a proactive building inspection system to catch things before they happen, like these other cities have? And Matthew Baudet, the commissioner, said, no, that's impossible. We couldn't do that. There's no way. We know people complain, they give us the complaints, and then we catch them that way. And so what do? We keep working on it. We keep writing about it. But now it is also in the hands of our counterparts on the policy team who are working on the Healthy Homes Initiative to try to actually get this legislated through the city council. And so this year during the budget hearing, now it's Marlene Hopkins as the new commissioner. I think it was, I'm trying to remember which, I think it was Bennett Lawson who brought it up. Hey, can we consider maybe down the road switching to a proactive building inspection system? And the commissioner said, yes, actually we have a plan to try to do that maybe in the next 5 years or so once the system actually gets updated, and now 2028 is when they're saying it's many years delayed. So this is all to say, like, it's a very long process, but if there's one sort of secret to the formula for all of us, it is just like, oh, you're not going to answer our questions, so that's fine. We're just going to keep asking. We're just going to keep hammering away at it, and eventually over that time, it sort of grows in the public consciousness, and it's sort of widely understood that, like, the city has an extremely outdated and ineffective building inspection system that just becomes part of the, like, backdrop that has suffused all of our collective understanding of this issue and why it's so important. So, one example.
Yeah, I think that was so exhaustive, and I think we can end there.
Well, Bing, I will go back to your
Yeah.
point earlier. You were talking about just the human stories, the narratives
Yeah.
that drive all of our articles.
Yeah.
And I know we love to get nitty gritty in filing dozens, hundreds of FOIA requests, getting our public records, getting our data. But we also have to keep those stories at the forefront of our minds too. So I wonder if you could all share a bit about how you strike that balance of kind of like the reportage with the storytelling and the narrative, and if there's a particular source or story that comes to mind for you that you think about a lot.
In terms of like the human face of a story. Yeah, I mean, the first story I did here was looking. So I got coffee with a Chamber of Commerce person who told me, oh, like, I just got to Chicago. There's this great industry there's this great industry that's gonna pop up in South Chicago. It's this new technology, quantum, and they're gonna have like jobs for people with like no college degrees that will pay like $80K. It's gonna be great. And I was like, wow, what a great promise. Like, oh, what a great idea, like, to be able to have high-paying jobs for people without requiring like all these different barriers, like getting an engineering degree. And anyway, so I kind of started going into this sort of enterprise story, looking at what is the promise here, like is it true? And what I found I've learned a lot about the industry. That it was young, mostly, research and development, mostly very talented scientists. But I think I think it was sort of in the last leg, I'm like, well, what is this story about? Is it about this industry? Is it about how many jobs are there? And then that's when I started to kind of talk to people in the community, and I realized, no, it's actually about like the 16-year-old kid who, has, and what he wants to do is he wants to be able to grow up and like have a job that can, and he wants to buy a house, and have a job where he doesn't have to worry about whether he's gonna make it financially that month. And I think, that's sort of more like speaking of the human face, right? You can get sort of lost in like, oh, I just found out like how many jobs there are in the quantum industry, But
Like when you get a really fancy record back or an exciting number and you just want to write that as like the
Yeah.
lead, and you have that urge to do that.
Right, but really it's about the teenager who's growing up in this community that needs that high-paying job, but can't really afford to go to college because he's working right now to support his family, but what he wants is to be able to get a job where he can live comfortably, and achieve some of his dreams, whether that's home ownership or not. So I guess like that sort of comes to mind when I think, it's looking for, well, who is this story about beyond just what is the answer to the question, data answer to the question. Anyone else?
I think about a woman named Renee Cook, who I featured in my most recent story about those wait times for folks who are found unfit for trial. And I learned about her through some great partners at the University of Chicago Mansueto Institute who worked with us on finding data. And basically, we had this big database of all of these names, and they were able to help us narrow it down of folks who had died in jail from the specific time period. And so I was able to use that list, and then I was able to see if any of those folks had been found unfit. And so Renee, there was 4 people on that list, and Renee Cook was one of them. And she was just kind of like a data point at that time. And then just getting some court records, I realized that she was in jail for misdemeanors, which was now pretty unusual. And I also learned through other court records that she had struggled with mental illness for most of her life. And so I wasn't able to find any next of kin. I knew she had like young adult children, but I couldn't find them. And so there was like one address on like LexisNexis, and I was just like, I wrote a letter and I like said a prayer and I mailed it. And I really wasn't expecting to hear anything back, but a family member called me, and they were pretty surprised that anyone was interested in her death. And so then I talked to that family member, and then I was able to talk to their kids, and who, you know, I think are still grappling with their mother's death, but I think in some ways it was healing for them to talk about their mother and the life that she lived, and, you know, acknowledge the tragic way that she died so that she's not forgotten. But I think, you know, in a lot of the work that we do, these folks start as these really just like this data point, and then you realize that the very full lives that have gone through a lot of ups and downs, and their family members don't want them to be forgotten.
Transit in the suburbs. There are people who live in the suburbs who don't own cars. Why is that a problem? Why is that hard for them? You and I, Grace, wrote a pair of stories that came out, I think about a month ago, right in the heat of all of the state legislative debate over transit funding that was very much like city versus downstate. How much is the state going to contribute to like the city and the CTA? We wrote about, and this is sort of like at first glance like a dry public finance story, amid all of this discussion about where are we going to find the money to fund public transit in Chicago. $200 million last year, this year it's certainly more, were collected by the 5 collar counties surrounded by Cook County that are in the RTA region through the RTA sales tax, the sales tax that the RTA collects. Because of a loophole in the sales tax, they're allowed to spend that money on jails, their sheriff's offices, courts, and street resurfacing. This is money collected for a transit agency. They spend about 2% of that money on actual transit. And their argument is sort of, we had talked to a lot of the county board chairs, like, well, this is Wheaton. What do we care about transit? Which is not what they said exactly, but like, they tried to say like, no, of course we care about transit. Like, look at this, this one bike path that we built, But then we go out and talk to people like, can you talk briefly about Kathy?
Laura?
Am I confusing? Yes.
Laura,
Talk about
yes.
Laura and Kathy.
Yes, so we wanted to show, the counties that do use a little bit of this money from the RTA sales tax for a county pilot program or paratransit program, usually with PACE buses. What kind of world does that look like? What are the possibilities of having more public transit in the suburbs? And so I talked with Laura Graff. She is in Kane County. And this was such a joyful story because she absolutely loves the Ride in Kane program. It allows her to call a couple days in advance, schedule a ride to come pick her up, and then takes her to church every Sunday morning. She used to drive a car. Her car broke down. She's in her 70s now, didn't want to get a new car, can't quite walk the distance to church. And now this program costs her about $2 for a ride. It's largely subsidized by the county and by PACE. And it serves people who are seniors, who may have disabilities, or within a certain, various demographics. And so we just put a spotlight on different counties that are doing this. MC Ride in McHenry County, or McRide, is also an amazing program. We talked with folks who are visually impaired, who rely on these programs to get to work or send their kids to daycare. And so that was a lovely change of pace for some of the jails coverage that we've been doing, to just speak with someone like Laura, who was so excited for me to come to her house and take photos of her getting on this bus and learning about this program that she loves and the bus drivers that she loves. And so that was, just someone I think about too.
Yeah, and I think it should, sorry, just to very briefly add on, it shows that there are these services that are so vital for some people, and these counties are so proud of, look at the $1 or $2 million, the sort of in the grand scheme of things, pennies that we're throwing at this program, but like, of course we need, $60 million for our sheriff's office this year. And it really, is a way to make vivid that expression of like, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value.
But also, I was gonna say, like, that's such a community story. Like, I think that's probably the highlight of her week. I imagine that's how she stays connected to the community. That's, it's such a bigger story than just her going to church each week or how a county delegates their money.
Peter, any particular characters, people, sources come to mind for you?
Yeah, there's two. The last big story I did at the Tribune, we wrote about an 11-year-old who was paralyzed by a gunshot, and we spent 6 months, more or less, with him and his family, and we were with him at Shirley Ryan when he was going through rehab, and we were there when he learned he wasn't going to walk again. And the pre-publication diplomacy process was like taxing, where we told the family, like, we're going to write about this, and we told the kid, like, your mom and dad were fighting, and your mom's upset at your father because your father wanted to have a son he could do man stuff with, more or less, and she was like, he's not a broken toy, and so there was all these like family dynamics. Anyway, so after the story came out, I got 2 text messages. One was from the boy's mother, who said that the story opened up space in her family to talk about things with her family that she hadn't talked about with them. And then the other was from a police officer who was a source, who had moved out of his role and was having he had moved out of like street work and into detective work, and he was having a hard time adjusting to like the paperwork. And he said it reaffirmed his decision to like try and become a detective, because he was like, this is the kind of stuff that like we should be trying to, like, if you shoot a kid, you should go away for that, right? When Casey and I, and Tom figured out that this gun that had been stolen from the police station had been used in 3 shootings, like, we found all the victims, and not one of them had known that they got shot with the gun that was in the city's possession. And Casey and Tom, actually, the kid who got caught with the gun, his public defender didn't know that the gun had been in the city's custody. And so just the act of like being able to talk to everybody, so me and Casey talked to one of the sets of victims, Casey and Tom talked to the other 2 sets, and to a person, they were appreciative of learning the information. They wouldn't have come across it otherwise. And we were up with them, with one of the families who had been shot at, and like one of the rounds landed. I mean, she showed us where she was standing. She showed us where it hit relative to where she was standing, where her son was standing. And it's kind of like, it wasn't like a religious experience, but maybe more like a spiritual experience, where I feel like this is like what we should be doing with our time. Like, it's a useful exercise to like try and hear from people who are hurting. And so like that's kind of like where I come back to with most of my work, is like, I've thought about like, well, if I was working in another city, what would I be covering? And I think that mostly what I would be doing is I'd find my way toward people who are hurting and try to explain like what happened, why did it happen, like what systems were involved, and yeah, it's tough. But it's, I mean, I think about Judy was the victim's mother's name. I think about her a lot. Like, we stayed in touch for a while, and that whole experience was sort of formative in my career.
You talk about what systems were involved in that hurt and connecting systems and people. And so, Alex, you were also mentioning this earlier, and making those systems legible, helping people understand how they work, why they're breaking down. You've done some awesome reporting lately on city budget issues, and you had a story come out today. Would you be able to talk a bit about that story, kind of how it came to be and what you found?
Sure. So we had just been trying to follow the city budget from the beginning, and we had a story earlier that was just sort of kind of a table setter, trying to sort of follow all of the like discourse around the budget. It seemed like there was a lot of missing context, and so it seemed like something that folks kept coming back to was, the city budget has grown so much, we're spending so much more, why can't we just cut all the spending? The city, the budget is so much bigger bigger now than it was before the pandemic, because we've had this big infusion of federal money. And so we had this pair of stories. One came out a couple weeks ago that was like, well, the reasons why the city budget has grown are maybe more complicated than we give credit for. We're basically paying for these mounting pension costs that we can't just like lower. A lot of, the city's employee headcount is actually down from where it was 5 years ago, and like they have collective bargaining contracts, and so their salaries are going up. So it's really not so easy to just be like, why can't we just like cut everything off and like bring the dollar amount back to where it was in 2019? This story that came out today was the second part of that, which is another sort of thing that has come up, or question that has come up is, well, why can't, instead of raising taxes or cutting vital services or whatever to close this giant city budget deficit, why can't the city just undo all of the new programs that the city created through ARPA, through the federal funding? It was just this sort of like an easy thing to reach for, like, well, pandemic's over now, pandemic funds are gone, they're out the door, we shouldn't be baking those into the city budget. But the question was, what exactly, if anything, is the mayor actually trying to put into the city budget going forward? And it turned out to be a really, really difficult question to answer. We eventually landed on a number, about $33 million for things like mental health outreach, for domestic violence services, for homelessness services. And that was really important, first of all, to be able to lay out for people so that they're not just saying like, hey, we need to cut this ARPA money. You're actually forcing people to say like, no, I want to cut this money for like relocation services for survivors of domestic violence, right? To actually know what they are. The other part of the story, though, is that the city was extremely tight-lipped about what these programs are, whether they, how they were tracking them. The city said that it was, did a sustainability analysis, basically to determine which of these ARPA-funded programs they wanted to keep and which one they wanted to cut. We FOIA'd for this document a month ago, and they asked for extension after extension after extension. This was like a big top secret thing, this like document that they put together to just like calculate which of these programs should we preserve. We got it last night, right before it published, and I sent it around. Don't clap yet, because I was like, oh yes, 109-page document. Literally almost every single page, giant black rectangle after giant black rectangle. Like, why do you even bother giving it to me? Like, fully redacted.
I think
So-
when you sent it in our Slack too, you said it
Yeah.
goes in like the Redactions Hall of
Redaction
Fame.
Hall of Fame, yeah. I was like, and so we just embedded the entire report into the story. And it's sort of a frustration of like, these programs and these things, at least on their face, like they're defensible. No one is saying that like, this money is wasted, but like, why is the city not letting anyone know about their methodology or knowing what the work is? I also just really quickly wanted to shout out, when we're talking about how stories impact people, a story that I'm thinking about a lot right now is Casey's story from a couple years ago about efforts to plow the sidewalks when it gets really snowy. Because I've noticed that there are a lot of sidewalks that that are really dangerous. And it turns out there are other cities that actually do that. And it may not be as wild or expensive as people think, and so that's another element. And Casey also talked to someone who uses a wheelchair and why that's a really big issue for that person, and so that's just another example of that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Thank you, Alex. And just a reminder that if anyone has questions, please raise a hand, write them down. We've got a question here in the back. Feel free to shout them out.
Wait, introduce yourself. I know who you are.
I think we got a really interesting thing about how when you're reporting on systems, but you also face and focus on the human element, you can connect those two. But in that particular case, it's very specific, right? Because people were able to file a lawsuit because they found out it was because it was stolen or disappeared.
No, it was stolen.
Yes, stolen. But I'm curious about sort of more system-wide stuff. I'm thinking, what did Renee Cook's kids think about finding out that this was systemic, that many people who were found unfit, in fact, had to wait months and several others have had
Not to speak for them, but I think it's a very complicated feeling. I think on one end, they were horrified. I think on the other end, they felt a relief that they weren't alone, if I'm articulating that in the best way possible, that, and also that people were interested and that people cared. So yeah, I'm just never not in awe that you'll cold call someone, like build up the courage to like cold call someone and like do your script and get everything, and then you'll do the spiel and you're probably rambling, but they'll be like, yeah, okay, I'll talk to you. And you're like, really? So yeah, it just really speaks to the power of those individuals and how vulnerable, like Bing said, and like the faith that they have to make something better.
Bing, do you want to talk about Claudia and Pilsen, which we're reporting on right now?
Hi, my name's Kenneth Newman, and I work on activists on some things. You need to realize that some of the money that you might be investigating, the mayor is more interested in supporting nonprofits than spending money like on capital improvements that are actually going to really make the city good. And that includes for the Park District and for Chicago Public Schools, who are in desperate need of more athletic facilities to keep young people out of trouble. But the mayor's not looking at that because the mayor wasn't an athlete, and he doesn't know the city because he grew up in Elgin.
Oh, the Claudia thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, so Alex and I are looking at the city's efforts to be more equitable in the ways that they create green space through tree plantings. And we walked around Pilsen with somebody who's, an advocate for tree plantings. I think it's just like the ways that the stories tie together. She said she had gotten into green space advocacy because she wanted her children to see monarch butterflies. She noticed that they were disappearing. She was like very worried about that. And it wasn't just because, who doesn't love, beautiful butterflies, but I think, but that they symbolize something for her. Monarch butterflies migrate, and she had moved here with her family as well. They migrate and thrive, and that's sort of what she wants for her children and for her community. And so, we're walking around the neighborhood, and there are things that are very specific. She pointed out the concrete cutouts that you can't plant trees if there's just concrete. But also, she also pointed out just stretches of blocks that were not green at all. But yeah, connected to her, this really, but I think the way that she told the story, of why it's so powerful. Was that sort of what you were getting at, or yeah?
And now we're neck deep in spreadsheets of mismatched data from the Department of Streets and Sanitation about where they're planting trees and where they apply concrete cutouts. And so it's just a long process of trying to knit these all together and tying data into how it actually matters for people like her.
I wanted to kind of expand on. Oh, we have a question right here. Do you want to shout out, or I can bring this over to you?
Thank you very much. I had two questions. First of all, I wanted to know, for that 109-page document, what was the reason for the redactions?
Ooh, great question. So provision 71F in the Illinois FOIA law is an exemption for preliminary notes and drafts, which basically the idea is we shouldn't have to share with the public, our first draft of what we were working on. Sounds pretty reasonable. This is probably the most abused exemption provision because the way that we've seen it used very often is just like anything that we didn't publish on purpose, we're just gonna call it a draft. So you're not supposed to see it, and so that was just our preliminary That was just us chatting, you know? Even though in this case, this was literally like, they described this as like, this is our operative planning document for how we're like making budget decisions. But they're like, no, it was just a preliminary draft. I mean, this is an issue that we encountered before with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. They said that they had master plans for the south and west side of Chicago for flood mitigation. We FOIA'd for them. They said, no, sorry, we can't because they're preliminary. And we said, no, they're not. They're strategic plans. And we sued, and then 10 months later, they settled with us and just gave them to us. So I guess the lesson is just like, fight it. It's BS exemption.
Okay, and just one more quick one, if you'll let me indulge you. It sounds like from your content, that we're reading, as well as, the storytelling that you're providing tonight, you're balancing between being a resource for the community, telling community stories, but you're also the Illinois Answers Project. And I'm just curious to know, as the Illinois governor, Illinois is already on the minds of people across the country, but has gotten to be so much so more as the Illinois governor travels and, it's been outspoken for various reasons. How does that impact, or does it impact the conversations that you're having when you're deciding on what content or what stories to pursue on the statewide level to explore and explain various policies? For example, 3 or 4 years ago, there was that big crime reform bill in Illinois that had some provisions that, would seemingly put law enforcement and hold them more accountable. And there's other things that are in Illinois that are interesting. Illinois has the highest property tax rate in the country. Illinois is, number 5 in, foreclosures that are expected in 2026. And not to mention, Illinois being the capital of wrongful convictions. So I just wanted to ask how you balance being like a community paper as well as, providing content on the over the state, if you don't mind.
That's a really good question. As you were talking, it wasn't any of the topics that you brought up, but something that came to mind for me, I mentioned writing about childcare and a childcare subsidy a little bit ago. My colleague Madison and I, we were interested in exploring childcare because we were 2 women. Madison has 2 kids in our early 30s. Like, this is a new phase of life that we're in with many of our friends, the cost of childcare, but also the governor, as creating the Department of Early Childhood, positioning Illinois as trying to be the best place to raise a kid, but also childcare has become a major political issue, an issue that could be at the forefront of the next presidential election, which maybe the governor will be a part of. Who knows? So I think that was also very much on our minds as we decided to dive into the topic of childcare, and we hope to continue to pursue it. So that's what came to mind when you were asking that question.
Yeah, no, that's like what stories we choose. I think that's a really good question. And I do think sometimes the community stories are also the national stories. So we did a series, Making It in Chicago, that's looking at like the topic of economic mobility and why it's so hard to succeed nowadays. And by succeeding, I just mean like, being able to pay your bills without having to worry. And as a part of that, we did community listening sessions. So we would go out to, like the YMCA or community groups in Inglewood and other neighborhoods, and people would just talk about like what's top of their mind, right? And they'll talk about medical debt, or they'll talk about transit. And like these are really local issues, but I also think these are issues in communities all across America. So I think like yes, like obviously local, state, national, but I do think there's a lot of intersection there. And when we talk to someone for a community story, it could also very much be a statewide story, or a national story. So I also, does that make sense?
So I did want to kind of go back to, oh, do we have another question over here? Yes?
Thanks. It seems like typically there's a resistance to to the institutions that you're covering to releasing information. So a lot of your work is asking for information, they say no, and then you figure out a way to find it. But theoretically, that doesn't have to be the case, right? I mean, you're actually providing a service to the city by pointing out things that need to be done that haven't been done right, that within a department, if I was the head of a department, I might want to know that, these guys are out here loafing off or taking guns or whatever. So, I mean, do you experience cooperation? Do people reach out? It would seem to me that it would take people of strength of character and integrity running a department who would want you to come in and help them. That's probably not what you're running into a lot of. But
We were just talking about this today, good agencies versus bad agencies.
With compliance on FOIA, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I've never had an agency be like, thank you for your service.
Really?
Not yet.
That hasn't
they
happened
can.
yet.
Anytime. We're waiting.
Yeah. No, that hasn't happened. I will say some agencies are better than others when it comes to complying with FOIA, like we had talked about. The governors, so my experience dealing with state government and with the city government, but these dovetail. So in dealing with the state government, people within the agencies will tell us, oh, everybody's just running scared because Pritzker's running for president, and so everything's got to get cleared through his office. All the agency communications down to the most obscure state agency. If we think it's going to be a heater, we got to clear it through the governor's communications people. And because they're afraid, they don't want to make people available off the record. They don't want to make any statements that are going to make any waves, whatever. I first noticed this in the mayor's office when I was just a cub reporter here, is that there's been this gradual creep of controlling communications toward the executive. So whereas like the fire department and police department, they used to sort of like run their own communication shops, and they knew their material, and the people within those shops kind of knew what was what. Each new mayor grabs a little bit more of the control of communications from the agencies. And so what ends up happening is you get almost nothing out of the agencies, and you just have to fight for the records and find sources within the agencies to sort of, to help you peek behind the redactions, to provide unredacted records once you know they exist, or to give you like, hey, you should FOIA for this record that you might not come across organically. So it is a fight, but they're not like, they circle the wagons. I don't think a lot of them, their first instinct is like, oh, we need to improve it. It's like, who is this going to jam up or who's going to make look bad? And so.
My theory, and emphasis on theory, I'm curious what you guys think, is just the proliferation of just PR people. I mean, there's statistics like X number of 3 times as many PR people as there are journalists. I'm guessing that number, but it's pretty big. And so I think that's also my theory on it, of just kind of creating this fortress of vice president of communications, with all due respect if there's any vice president of communications in this attendance, but you know what I mean? I think just creating this system of, and also, I also, again, theory, wonder, just social media. We'll get our message out there. We have communication channels that we can do. We don't need the local paper anymore, if there's much of a staff there anyway. So that's kind of my theory. It's kind of going back to a larger ecosystem of just where local news is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Grace, just resourcing is a huge part of it, especially in some of the smaller offices. And even in the city of Chicago, we deal with FOIA offices that are just swamped. I'm getting 20 requests a day, and like my job today is just to make this request disappear as fast as I possibly can. If I need to reach for an exemption just to get through the day, then I'll do that. But also, to your point, Meredith, that like, in many cases, it's like the infrastructure has gotten so big that somehow it's like getting in its own way. And it's like, how can that be? Why is that? You would think that if there are more people on the mayor's communication staff, then they would have more interest in getting out the information that needs to get out. Sometimes the way that I think of it is that within every communications office, there's sort of like these two warring kind of like spiritual, there's like there's a lawyer on one side and there's like a PR flag on the other side. And it's like the devil and the angel on the shoulders of like. Which one's the devil? So there might be a PR person who is thinking like, there are all of these great things that this agency is doing. They're doing such good, important work. And I've encountered a lot of this just in my reporting of like people who want to get this to you. We have these public servants who like, they deserve their day in the sun. They deserve to get recognized for what they're doing. And then they will come up with all this stuff and then they give it to the lawyer who's like, oh, no. The lawyer says, you say as little as possible all the time, no matter what. Because you just limit your exposure to anything and you limit the ability for things to get misinterpreted. And so that's how you end up with, a 109-page document with like 6 words of readable text on it. Because it's just like, to them, it's just the more narrow, like, what's the least that we can possibly say while still fulfilling this? But then that ultimately becomes self-defeating because it's like you're not communicating with the public that way. You're just checking a box and covering your own butt.
Can I just say that that's also what makes some of my answers kind of special, though, is that you guys get to annoy the hell out of these people and not let it go for months and months versus, news organizations I'm sure you guys have all been at that have a daily beat where you can't necessarily run down FOIA over and over and over and make sure they follow it. So they see you guys' name on it and they're like, okay, we better just get this in 10 months, but still.
Yeah, it is a luxury that we have to be able to fight things. Absolutely.
We've all gotten so good at the passive-aggressive, cheerful email. Maybe not you, Peter. Maybe just straight up.
Aggressive, aggressive.
Oh,
That's a good question.
I think it goes back to Alex's point of like where their priorities are. So obviously, maybe they don't prioritize that as much. Yeah, I don't know. Also, government jobs versus the corporate world, the private sector. I mean, those salaries do all the storytelling. So.
You talked about, some really great, happy, things that's rewarding for you. But are there moments in our ecosystem, in our public life that provide openings? For example, the pandemic, created a moment for people to look at certain things. Are there things in public life where, something happens, somebody, that you find, okay, this is our chance to go get this. Or it it tamps down the lawyer where the flag says, look, we're going to tell this story today. Are there moments like that?
When I was covering gun violence, I thought there was one, and I was wrong. I was like so disappointed and disheartened and just completely shocked that.
Good news here, man.
Yeah, I know. I'm not probably the one to.
I think.
I wish I was like so disappointed, but.
I think to your just example of the pandemic, I hope this answers your question, but I was in Delaware at the time working for the state paper there, and in the early days of the pandemic, everyone was looking to similar to the Tribune sometimes, like everyone was looking to the local paper of like, where can I get a mask? Where can I get a test? What is the governor saying? I mean, I think for all of the states, how many of us were watching the respective governors' press briefings that were often streamed through the local paper? And so I think whether that was a flash in the pan or it's something that we can sustain, I think that brought the value of local news, like local to the forefront, kind of like the Mr. Rogers of like looking for the helpers, like the local reporters were really the helpers amongst obviously the medical staff and whatnot. But I think that really showed the value of local news, specifically in moments of crisis. So that's what came to mind for me.
Casey's got. There's questions back there.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I am based in Harvey, Illinois, so I do a lot of reporting in the Southland. My first question is, I've been arrested for covering a Harvey City Council meeting. Actually, my alderwoman's been arrested 4 times for asking questions about finances. People have come to my house to dox me. The mayor has hired someone to attack me and others. So what do you guys do in this sort of work? Do you ever encounter threats to your safety? And if so, how do you handle that? Have you been doxxed? Have you had people stalk you? Have you had people threaten you online? Have you had people, I'm probably gonna have to do a defamation suit because my mayor said in the city council meeting that at a teaching job, I left a teaching job because I was abusing children, sexually abusing children, which wasn't true at all. But I mean, when you do this kind of work, at least for me, I find in the Southland, like it's brutal. It's brutal. But does it ever personally affect you like that? And if it does, how have you handled it?
First of all, I'm really sorry that that's happened to you. Bing and I, unfortunately, have a personal anecdote. We worked at the Capitol Gazette. It was my first paper, one of Bing's first papers, where sadly and tragically, our coworkers were murdered. And so that is ever present on my mind. That being said, that community rallied to get around the paper and has really uplifted the paper. But yeah, I think reporter safety is something that I think about a lot. I'm very lucky. I haven't experienced anything that's made me feel unsafe. I've been at work for great places that have made me feel safe. So I'm really lucky. But also, I do things where like I have a separate phone number. I don't give out any personal details that I feel like could be crossing a line or boundary. I don't really do like source drinks or anything like that. I think reporting while female is a thing that many female reporters talk about. So yeah, I feel very lucky. Again, I'm sorry to hear about your experience. But yeah, of course, it's ever present in terms of the current climate.
I would love to see if we can break the fourth wall and have Casey answer this question as a guest star, both as a veteran of Southland reporting and as someone who's done a lot of reporting on, unsavory types.
When I was covering Riverdale, the village of Riverdale, which is right next door to Harvey, I wrote a story about there's this marina that there's this fraudster who was basically using the marina to steal money from the village of Riverdale, a poor village. And so I went there because it was just this like cast of like clowns and crooks that were working at the marina property. And I went to confront one of them, and because I thought it was him, but I had to ask. So I was like, Ron? He goes, yeah, that's me. Casey Toner, nice to meet you. But then when I went home, my boss got a call from the fraudster himself, who said that he had like video of me like being drunk or something like at the site, and he was going to release it unless we killed the story. And my boss was just furious, not at me, but at him, and said some expletives. But we published it, and he eventually went to prison. But stuff like this does happen. Like sometimes there are like moments that get really heated. With like the super mayor in Dalton, we had a meeting that just got out of control, and I was there with Dane Placco of Fox 32, and they like kind of shoved the table into him, and he said something like, I've gotten elbowed by worse afterwards. So this stuff does kind of happen, and I do think about it, especially as I get older. Like like when Peter and I wrote about some of the people with the guns, like I think about that more often. I think about guns. A bullet can pass through a glass door, for example. I think about these things, and luckily nothing has gotten to that point. But it is something that I think people deal with when you're in the public spotlight a little bit.
Chris Rooney here, BJ board member, interested Chicagoan. I wonder if the panel could talk about, you talked about how like sometimes an investigation leads to another story that you didn't know was there, but like, how do you know when to stop, like when the limits of that story are? I'm just thinking about, Peter, you talked a lot about the missing gun case, and I thought I remember hearing something about like the young lady, the officer that unfortunately lost her life this summer, was like somehow involved in like, had been in the church or something, or like had handled a gun, and then lost her life in this unfortunate friendly fire event. And like if you wanted to, you could go into some crazy conspiracy theories about that, but you didn't, right? Like some organizations might. Like how do you determine what leads or just you don't want to chase?
Yeah, I mean, no, we did, like the night of, we were like, did she get shot on purpose? We absolutely run that down. I mean, you ask right away, like, how did this shooting happen? What can you tell us about how it happened? And immediately everybody's like, well, are you asking because, and it's like, well, yeah, because she helped look for a gun that a cop stole from a police station, and then her partner killed her. I mean, that's not crazy to think about, like, did that, no, we'll be writing about that story for years. I mean, just the process that the internal affairs process, the amount of time that takes. I will say, like, one of the things that happens fairly frequently is so with that story, for example, we obviously didn't know the officer was going to get shot. We just wrote the story. When that happened, we started looking at the officer who shot her. And that opens up like a whole separate avenue of like behavioral questions about him and discipline questions that's unrelated to the gun. I mean, it's related in that they were on the same team, but he wasn't a participant in that. And so the FOIA is basically cascade from there. One of the things we do frequently is we request email logs and other communications. And when we get the logs back, you'll see the things that are on point to your inquiry, right? You'll see like, we might search by a specific term or whatever, but you'll see other things in there too where it's like, what's that about? And we found things that way that open up like new tangentially related inquiries, but also just whole new topics for us to cover. I don't know that there's a good answer for when does it end, but I think as long as we have curiosities to satisfy about this, we'll keep trying to answer those questions.
I don't want to speak for everyone else here who's a reporter, but there's a term that we use, like, let's put it on the back burner. So, like, there's always more stories that we want to do than we are actively pursuing. So, like you said, like, there may be a secondary story or a third story or fourth story. You might not get to all of it. So I think a lot of what reporting is prioritizing, like, what has to go, maybe because someone was saying, like, timely, So yeah, I don't actually think a story completely dies ever, right?
There are things that don't get done, which sucks. That's there. Like,
I mean, sometimes
yeah, I mean, there was like, we've had stories where we think like, oh, that's a good story, but the moment passes. Like, it's just, the time is too distant from its occurrence. There's just things that happen sometimes where you have to walk away from it. But if you have the opportunity to run to ground, I think it's worth trying to. I don't like walking away from.
I mean, sometimes your editor says, okay, you're stopping now. But I think for like restraint chairs, you can talk to this too, but I think it's walking the fine line of finding something that is new, that adds to the drumbeat that we were talking about, that's not repetitive. I think that's a really hard line to walk. And I think also, like, just my personal opinion, it's important to take a pause, whether how long that can be determined, but also to like write about other stuff, to like open your mind to a different aspect of the world that you didn't know about. I mean, you writing about like the transportation story was, I think, a great thing for your mental health, but also just like brought you down a different path of reporting that you never would have. And so I think that's important for reporters also, to balance mental health with curiosity, with finding what's new that people are going to read.
Yeah, just to add also to that comment about the Restraint Chairs project, that first story took 9 months. The whole thing, I think, took a year and a half. And I had to basically force myself to stop. Crystal had to force me to stop. And that's something that I probably could have kept going. I mean, there's probably someone at this exact moment strapped down in a restraint chair in an Illinois jail. Like, it's still happening right now. And so that's difficult to let go of when you know that is actively happening. But I think the way that we wrap that up is we felt like we had picked out the biggest top line findings, takeaways. We dove deep into a handful of specific counties, kind of worst offenders, and kind of completed the life cycle of investigative journalism with 3 solution stories, pointing to how have 3 other states tried to solve this exact problem, and kind of lay it out on a silver platter for Illinois. If you want to do something about this, here's how 3 other places approached it. And so I think that was psychologically helpful for me to know that like that was kind of where the series ended. But it also didn't end because it became the DHS story and is also related to a few other jail stories we have going too. So every little incremental story or advancement leads to, 5 additional possible routes.
We have another question.
I just wanted to make a quick offer and say that I think readers and communities really enjoy when a journalist stays with the story, stays on it, and comes up with new information. And the community knows that you're still, maybe you may not be actively writing a story, but you're still, you're still researching, you're still finding, you're still uncovering. So that I think the communities appreciate that.
I think something also that's really special about our newsroom and the work that we do is that we can do events like this, but also do events that can serve as a follow-up and have us interact with readers. So I think that's also really special in terms of the follow-up and continuing the story.
We just have a few minutes left, so maybe one more question. Yeah, over here.
Hi, thanks. I really appreciate the work that you and the time that you all put into your stories, and I can see that it's genuine from you. My question is, we want journalism to keep going, like from Riverdale, Dalton, Cal City, Chicago, all over the state. Are there any programs or anything to encourage our youth, maybe in high school, public high school? Do you guys have mentoring programs or anything that you can go into the schools and introduce journalism to kids, or something like this for kids who may want to be a journalist? Because there's so many stories, think about it, that our young people may have that can be uncovered. Is there anything like that, or are there any resources or funding? Is there funding or anything like that?
I think that funding, as you say, is the big question, right? Like the young people need to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel if they pursue this, if they develop these skills, that there will be jobs. There are so many smart kids coming out of journalism schools every year, and fewer journalism jobs. I mean, in Illinois, I think that Northwestern Medill report that came out last year showed that over the past 20 years, Illinois has lost the greatest percentage of working journalists of any state in the US. So in Illinois in particular, it's incredibly dire. I mean, we have internships, we mentor other journalists quite often. I don't know if we've ever gone into high schools, but we've talked to student papers before.
Yeah, not to say this in front of my bosses, but let's talk after. I'd love to that idea, because I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I got into journalism because I signed up for an elective in high school that was the student newspaper, and then I was like, oh, okay, I'll do this forever now. That sounds good. And here I am. So yeah, I think that's really important, and I think also communicating with the younger generation of I think often kids, I feel very old, but the youth on TikTok are doing journalism that they just don't realize is journalism. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities there, which could be really exciting. And also channeling a form of activism into journalism, so.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think about a lot and even struggle with, what do we say to younger journalists who are thinking about getting into this field? Because on the one hand, it's I love this job. I get to do, I think someone, it was Mo Rocker or someone described journalism as I'm in school, but I'm only taking extracurriculars. I'm just learning about fun new things every day. And it's incredible. But on the other hand, it's how the infrastructure has diminished so much and the opportunities are so much fewer. And I think that there can be a temptation to be know what you're getting into. And sometimes that looks like, a kind of, what really bothers me, which is a lionizing of the it's a really hard industry and don't expect to get paid a lot, because that's not what it's about. I think of that as really just sort of legitimizing the idea that this is not a field that should be valued. And so this just gets into a larger how do we all not not just do the work of trying to convince young people that this is something that's worth getting into because it's so incredibly rewarding, but how can we all collectively, you know, like with budgets, show that we value that this is actually something that we value, that we want to put resources into, that is worth investing in young people who are very smart and ambitious and have lots of talent and ideas. And it's sort of our collective choice of like, are we willing to actually put the resources forward to invest in this because we decide that it's important?
Yeah, I think, I remember when I was young, I would get really annoyed when older journalists would be like, do not get into this. That's a bad idea. You know, it felt like they were like closing the door behind them a little bit, you know. But I will say, like, yes, we need just like better, I think like getting rid of unpaid internships. When my first newspaper job was an unpaid job where I had to beg my dad to help me rent a car so I could drive the car around for my unpaid internship. And I think it was another unpaid internship that I funded with working at a restaurant. I think things are, you know, I think like now 40-hour internships largely are more paid, but I think, you know, like creating those opportunities for young people is really important. Yeah, and I think like also like being realistic like about it, but also encouraging too, you know, because I think like just like it's so easy to be discouraging and saying like, you know, the industry's shrinking, but I think if you really wanted to, you could make it work, right? It's just like, do you want to go to like, are you down for going to South Bend as a 22-year-old, you know? So, yeah.
Something that I think about that I was really fortunate is like also seeing my parents and how they consume the news. Like literally, I think to this day, my parents like eat popcorn, pour a glass of wine, and watch WGN at 9. Like that's what they do every single day. And so that's what I grew up, and they read the Evanston Roundtable. I grew up in Evanston, and they subscribed to the Tribune. So I was really lucky that I had parents that like consumed the news, and I watched that. And so I think that's something that we can do for the younger generations in our life of just like showing them good news habits and news literacy.
So we hope the lovely people like you all continue to come out and support us and read our work and support our journalism so that we can have the next generation come behind us. But thank you all so much for joining us. I think we have maybe some more drinks. We have the space for a little bit longer. So thank you, everybody.